Hi, Luke here, and we're continuing our series in Genesis 1 to 11, the story of everything. And today, the story of Noah, part 2. Now, we looked at the story of Noah last Sunday, and we looked at the way in which judgment is a symbol of the way in which sin leads to death. Now, during our series, in the book of Genesis, we've had this imaginary character called the neighbor, someone you might be quarantined with, someone across the on the other side of the fence, a colleague, a workmate, and this imaginary person is you're talking with this imaginary person about life, meaning in the universe, and perhaps some of the themes of Genesis. So you're trying to think, how would I explain the themes of Genesis to this person, to this neighbor? And I've imagined that the neighbour is Wilson here's a picture from Home Improvement, and I don't know if you remember, it's an old show, and Wilson was the guy on the other side of the fence, and you could only ever see the top of his face, and he'd have these sort of meaningful discussions. So I'm kind of imagining this person that you're having meaningful discussions with, and you've talked about the pandemic, and you've thought, well, what does the pandemic mean? And you've explained that judgment or plagues like this in the Bible on a really big scale are a symbol of judgment, not necessarily linked to a specific sin or a specific person, but a symbol through which to understand themes of the Bible. So you might have been explaining this. And then the next question in Genesis, the next question your neighbor might have is, what's next? What happens after that? What follows a judgment? I don't know about you, but I'm definitely thinking, what's next? What will the world look like after the pandemic? What will the world look like after quarantine? How will things change? And I've got 3 headings here. And I'm thinking about what follows a judgment. And Genesis 8, 9, and 10 explain to us that God remembers, Noah gets drunk, and we get a second chance. That's what follows a judgment. That's what takes place in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see that that's a bit of a pattern. God remembers, Noah gets drunk, and we get a second chance. God remembers. We see that in the first verse 1, the verse 24 of chapter 7 overlaps. It's the last verse of chapter 7 and the first verse of chapter 1 in your Bibles. So verse 1 of chapter 8 reads, "But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock that were with him in the ark." By the way, just a quick tangent. This is a little foreshadowing of Jonah. Remember Jonah, and God has mercy on the city of Nineveh, who sort of withholds his judgment this time, and remembers the city, remembers even the animals of the city. Here God remembers Noah. And it's not a sort of a Santa Claus type remembering, God's judging the world with the flood and then thinks, where's the ark? Where did I put it? There he is. There's Noah. Found him. It's God takes action. God does something. That's what God remembers means. So the first part of your answer to your neighbor, the first part of explaining what follows in a judgment, is explaining that God is going to take action, that God has taken action and will take action. You're able to explain that. It was really sad to read in Time magazine a Christian bishop saying something along the lines of, well, this is the heading of the article that he wrote: "Christianity offers no answers about the coronavirus. It's not supposed to." A really depressing hot take on the coronavirus. on this pandemic. Because the first thing that we discover about this judgment, this particular judgment in the book of Noah, is that God remembers. God remembers Noah. God takes action. Now, to really get our heads around the significance and the importance of this business of God remembering, we need to think about the story of Noah again, and let's think about the film, the 2014 film starring Russell Crowe. You might remember it from my last talk. I explained how this 2014 film is a great piece of fan fiction. It's a great retelling of the story of Noah, and one of the interesting things about the film is where they expand on the biblical narrative and where they kind of follow very faithfully to the text. It's a great film. It's great to bring that story of Noah to life and to make you think about the biblical story and how and why they've made this film. But you might remember they get it wrong at a crucial moment. So you can see here this picture of the moment where they get it wrong. It's a great moment, well filmed, dramatic. There's Noah, the flood's coming in, and can you see he's holding on to the rope because he pulls the door closed. Noah closes the door of the ark in the film. But in the biblical narrative, God closes the door of the ark. You see, the first thing to remember is that God remembers Noah. It's not about Noah's ingenuity. We may discover a vaccine, well, hopefully sooner than later, or really good treatments, or discover that more people get immunity so we can come out of the quarantine. But it won't. The key thing to remember is that it's not our ingenuity. It's not Noah's ingenuity. It's not Noah's strength. It's not Noah's goodness. Even though he was a good guy, it wasn't him that saved himself. It was God who saved Noah. God reaches into our world, takes action. This idea is a foundational idea for Christianity. And I've got a quick illustration here of how you can apply it to your thinking. So in this diagram here, it just compares a few different worldviews, and you can have lots of permutations of these particular worldviews. The basic idea is you have the creator and the creation, God and the world. With deism, God creates the world and throws away the key and does something else, goes and watches a movie, and has no more interaction with the world. Sort of presses the button for the Big Bang, that's it, no more. Pantheism, where God and the world are the same thing. Materialism, where only this world, only this stuff exists. There is no God, it's only stuff. And then lastly, Christianity, where the Creator comes into the world. It's the basic foundation of the story of Jesus. We are able to know who God is. All right, what follows a judgment? What's next? God remembers, and now Noah gets drunk. So verse 20, and let me just move on with slides here. Verse 20, Noah, a man of the soil or the ground, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. It's a pretty seedy sort of story. It's told very economically, just a few words, but you can see that it's unpleasant. Noah's doing something shameful, and then Ham, his son, makes a big spectacle of it. And then Shem and Japheth kind of turn round, hold the blanket over their shoulders, and kind of walk in backwards so that they can cover Noah. And then if you read the rest of chapter 9, you see Noah, not God, Noah cursing Ham and then blessing the other two sons. So what follows a judgment? People are still sinful. We'll talk about the covenant in a moment. We'll talk about the promise that God makes in the first half of chapter 9 in a moment. Although even in the midst of that promise, God says, I'm going to make a promise, but you're all evil. Every inclination of the human heart is evil, even from childhood, says God, but I'll still make the promise with you. Which is kind of a little echo back of what God said to Adam when he said, cursed is the ground because of what you've done. So we see from Noah getting drunk that people still seek themselves. And with Ham, the father of Canaan, trying to make a spectacle of it, the people still seek shame. And we see that sin still needs to be covered up with the brothers Shem and Japheth coming and covering up Noah. So I guess the second thing, if you were talking about what follows a judgment, what follows a pandemic, what follows a quarantine, you're trying to explain things to your neighbour, the second thing to say is, well, people are still going to be the same. People are still going to be sinful. People are still going to seek pleasure. People are still going to seek shame, and it'll still need covering up. But during the pandemic and after the pandemic. So what follows a judgment? God remembers, Noah gets drunk, and we get a second chance. And you see the second chance. The second chance begins in verse 1 of chapter 9. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. You see, surviving the flood was a second chance for Noah. Surviving this pandemic will be a second chance for us. And surviving the final judgment will be a second chance for everybody who loves Jesus. That's the last thing to say that Genesis says about what follows from a judgment, what's next, is a second chance. And in a way, the whole story of the flood and the covenant, and then this table of nations, which we'll talk about in just a sec, in chapter 10, is all a second chance. Now, God gives this second chance. He begins it with a promise, with a covenant in chapter 9, that he won't destroy the world, despite people's sinfulness, and the rainbow is a promise of God not destroying the world. Here's a sign that I won't destroy the world in this particular way. And then we come to the table of nations. Just a quick tangent about thinking about the genre of this chapter and why it's constructed in that way. I find it hard to remember Amy's phone number. So if I'm asked, filling out a form, next of kin, I've got to look up in my phone, I've got to look up Amy. Well, because I just call Amy. I don't call the number every time. I don't remember it. I don't have that brain for numbers. Amy's got a brain for remembering songs and numbers and facts and all sorts of things like that. Whereas I've got a brain for remembering where things are, the location of things, the capitals of countries, the chronology of events. And so this chapter is organized in such a way that you can kind of remember. It's not just a pure list of names. There's descriptions mixed in, and the names are grouped in particular ways, and so it's a device to help you remember it. But that doesn't quite explain why it's here. Why, even if it's built in such a way that a pre-technology, that a pre-electronic and type of culture can remember it, why is it here? Why is it in this story before the story of the Tower of Babel? Why not just go straight to the Tower of Babel? Well, the clue that answers that is verse 32 of chapter 10. These are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent. With in their nation and from these nations spread out over the earth after the flood. This little concluding sentence, this little conclusion, is a clue that this chapter 10 is in parallel, is similar, is kind of repeating in a different way chapter 5. And chapter 5 is that chronology from Adam through to Noah. And so, briefly, I want to just show you that the story of Noah, and particularly the end after the flood, and chapters 8, 9, and 10, are designed to make us see God recreating. God is doing a second creation, a second chance. So, just briefly, chapters 5 and 10, there's a parallel, there's a similarity there. There's a similarity when God says at the beginning of the new covenant, he says, be fruitful and increase in number. That's what he said to Adam back in chapter 1. There's a parallel between Adam and the first family and Noah and the first family. It's like these two origin families. There's this miraculous growth in chapter 1 and miraculous growth in chapter 8 when the dove flies back with fresh leaves, even though the world's been underwater. Somehow, supernaturally, the ground is regrowing. The ground is still is responding supernaturally, just like it did back in chapter 1, sort of Narnian style, the magician's nephew style. This growth just bursting up out of the ground. You should read the Narnian Chronicles if you haven't already. There's also a parallel between the condemnation of human evil in chapter 6 and chapter 8. There's both Cain and Abel build an altar, Noah builds an altar, the ground is cursed, Noah works the ground, Noah is commanded to, also Adam is commanded to look after and be a steward and care for the ground, and Noah builds a vineyard. Adam and Eve realize that they're naked, and then God clothes them. Noah's naked, and two of his sons cover him up. And they're just the main parallels that I've spotted, which shows us that this section is a replay with differences of the previous section. God's giving Noah and humans a second chance. Oh, by the way, I forgot to show you the map here of chapter 10. So this is someone imagining where all the places might go, and you can notice that there's this Middle Eastern focus. That there's and we're not quite sure where some of these places are. It's a bit of a guess, but you can see that by grouping them together like this, it's easier to remember. And just as we're not told every single name between Adam and Noah, it's not as though those other people aren't important. And obviously other people existed, but we're just and you can go back and look at that chapter and see in which the way in which God is playing out the themes of Genesis 1 to 4 in Genesis 5. But Genesis 10 is that similar pattern. It's a playing out of the themes. It's showing us that God is recreating people. He's repopulating the earth, even if we're not sure exactly where things are. Even if we're not sure the connection between the name given in the text and where it is in the world. So, you're talking to your neighbour, you're thinking, I'm thinking, what's next? What follows God's judgment? Well, God remembers, Noah gets drunk, and we get a second chance.